we will have this quite special hybrid format, but I will manage the dialogue and discussion here in the room for the last part of the debate. And we can start by introducing our guest, and probably Paola, if you want to do so, I can give you the floor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Valentin. Everybody can hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we are really very, very happy to have this this evening together with Grete de Blok and Erik Swyngedouw. And we thanks very much, Erik, for coming back, although not physically, but at least mentally staying with us. So as Valentin is saying, this is we are almost to the conclusion of this first round of sessions that we have organized with the new postgraduate and master in urban and territorial design. So the students that are in the room, and some also of the students that are online, they participate. They are the first students of this program, of this brand new program, and is the second last occasion, because of the last one before Christmas will be with Eva Fannes. I saw Eva appearing on online. So let's say we are getting to the conclusion, and we are quite happy of this cycle, and we hope also in the next year to continue with this very interesting moment of conversation and dialogue. So this session number 5 is together with Grete de Blok, that is an architect, but also an urban planner. And her teaching and writing focus on infrastructure and technology as driving forces of urbanization, mobilizing history to provide insight in and critical reflections on the current urban condition, and also in relation to the design theories and practices. Her recent publications advance on interdisciplinary approach, linking urbanism with engineering, political geography, philosophy, and landscape studies to explore the connection or the disconnection between ecological design and socio-political agendas. And Grete, she will introduce. I think Grete, you are the first to start, and she will go through certain also notion that we are also very interested to discuss with her, like for example the notion of techno nature. Erik Swyngedouw, so many of you already met Erik in presence at the beginning of this sessions cycle, but for those that were not there, I remember to you that Erik is a human geographer, is professor. I'm sorry, I didn't say that Grete is a professor of urban design at an urban theory, I think, Grete. At the University of Antwerp, while Erik Swyngedouw is professor at the University of Manchester and member of the Manchester Urban Institute. But he comes from a different field, in fact, because it's the field of agricultural engineering and then urban and regional planning from the KU Leuven. And he has honorary doctorates from the Malmö University in Sweden and Roskilde University in Denmark. He has studied and he has made his PhD under the supervision of David Harvey at the beginning of the 90s, and has taught in different places. What is important is that his interest focuses on political ecological issues related to water, transformation of nature, and urban governance. And he is reflecting in deep on this figure of post-democratic city, which will be also one of the leitmotif of its contribution. So I propose to start, if Grete, you are ready, and I give you the floor. And thanks again for this occasion.
Many thanks. I will try to share my screen. It's always an exciting moment. Let me see. Does that work? Yes.
Maybe, yeah, full. Perfect.
Right.
Perfect.
Great. All right. So first of all, thank you, Paola, for the invite. I'm very much looking forward to the debate with Erik and to the questions of the audience, of course, later. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I will explore relations between design and politics. And the general hypothesis of the talk is fairly simple. It states that ecological design tends to follow technical and managerial rationales, thus neglecting sociopolitical questions about who and what is in or excluded in the planned spatial intervention and whether that is socially just. More so, the statement is that current ecological design has generated many projects that are uncritical of market-driven urbanization and negligent or even reckless towards vulnerable populations. And as a conclusion, I will explore a few paths, ways to reconnect the ecological with the sociopolitical, and maybe even have a go at connecting design to the political, as defined by Erik as a disruptive event. So here we go. So in an attempt to give you a hands-on example of what is at stake in this talk, I will start with an anecdote, a straw man, if you like. So a couple of years ago, a talk of Patrick Schumacher, the principal of Sahadit Architects, caused a lot of commotion. He presented a manifesto advocating the abolishment of state intervention and associated social regulation of housing, or indeed any form of social engineering. And this explicit neoliberal stance caused many shocked reactions, even protests at the office of Sahadit. And in the same year, and with the same agenda of market-based urban order, he gave lectures and is still lecturing about parametric design and ecology. And in these lectures, he argues for a multi-species environment not determined by program, but scripted by parameters from, amongst others, ecology and topography, generating landscapes that are inherently balanced, harmonious, beautiful, to be enjoyed. And the fluid, continuous spatial forms are to be filled again by the market. And strangely, these lectures cause no upheaval or protests at all. So, and this is what I would like to explore with you, because I think we can actually see a lot of parallels with many other urban design firms today, be it without an explicit focus on market-driven urban order. And although many of these designers would be equally shocked by Schumacher's manifesto, the link between parametric design or design mainly following a natural science rationale and a far-reaching neoliberal, even post-political stream is present in design discourse in general today and is in need of contestation. So in the following, I will approach ecological design from how it is conceived in urban design and landscape architecture. More specifically, I will focus on how ecological agendas and urban development are conceived in tandem in landscape and ecological urbanism. And the reason why I'm focusing on these discourses is because I think they're very, very promising in many ways. They produce interesting new cartographies, are able to work with multi-scalar dynamics, their infrastructural focus. So this talk will come across as a harsh critique, but please frame it within a context of trying to find ways to do better. So these new isms were launched, and you know them all, I guess. They were launched more than a decade ago, almost two decades ago, by prestigious schools like Harvard, UPenn, and the AA in London, and are now widely adopted in practice and supported by policy. And designers counter risks related to flooding, desertification, soil erosion, and decreasing biodiversity with linked socio-ecological systems. And these designs particularly foreground the alliance between ecology and infrastructure design, in which indexing and diagramming techniques translate environmental, topographical, and geographical parameters into bottom-up mechanisms, often centering around a densely programmed ecological corridor, weaving an undefined urban fabric together. And in order to meet the central aim of setting up co-adaptive and self-organizing socio-ecological interactions, ecological design is grounded in sophisticated data, collecting sophisticated data coming from the new super science of landscape ecology, fusing the natural and the social sciences, ecological systems with socio-spatial development. And it has engaged in an impressive, productive, and successful alliance, I think, with the natural sciences, incorporating the latest development in ecosystem ecology. However, I think that the connection with the social sciences is problematic and needs more thinking. The development of new kinds of interdisciplinary insights and related sophisticated analytical techniques with an emphasis on the systemic connection between the natural and the social risks, according to me, anti-developmental tropes, or indeed the renewed philosophical naturalism. It seems like the designer only has to uncover the bottom-up systems and materialize these in ecological and landscape infrastructures, while the correct urbanization will automatically follow from this. The social or indeed socio-spatial development is considered as a product of an all-encompassing dominant natural development, which does not require explicit and sustained reflection. To naturalize urbanization seems to be the new mission, instead of thinking critically about deurbanization or commodification of nature. Design seems to be predicated on the implicit belief that there are systemic and universal laws governing socio-ecological systems. And although I'm sympathetic to the non-human literature foregrounding the thing as an actor in the human-non-human network, I have profound difficulties with the fact that in current design, landscape and ecology, or more concrete, the system, is usually given more agency than the designer, than people. The underlying modernist trauma displacing authorship by concepts such as emergency and performance, by turning the descriptive in the prescriptive, the parametric analysis into the project, or in other words, where biophysical systems become norms for societal development, is worrying, to say the least. There is no social mobility in nature, to quote Lorraine Daston, or to quote Nigel Thrift. Classical ethical questions like, what have I done and what ought I to do, become much more difficult when the I in these questions is so faint. The post-human discourses are actually producing quite unsettling theoretical ethical stances, as illustrated by this quote from the prominent academic Donna Haraway. The seemingly soft eco-sensitive attitude of thinking with, living with, and designing with non-human is currently leading to depoliticized stances advocating the systemic rather than the intentional, and even leading to ethically quite problematic positions or even eco-fascist tendencies, to paraphrase Timothy Morton. So here is a problem statement. The long-established lineage of urban design with the social and political sciences is losing ground. The ecological interventions are firmly grounded in local physical natural space, but whether they take local, socio-political, and cultural context into account as well is an open question. And do not get me wrong, most ecological designs do include vague good intentions about cultural diversity, equality, the public good, by including public buildings, recreation, or even symbolic, allegorical, formalist interventions, like in this image. But what is largely sidelined is explicit reflection on socio-political agendas and power struggles. The mobilization of complex, sophisticated technical methods focusing on managing local parameters in combination with generic ideas about the public good efficiently function together to reduce controversy, reach stakeholder consensus, and thus circumventing political struggle and explicit socio-political priorities. And in doing so, maintaining or strengthening certain political constellations and existing agendas. So in short and in general, ecological design tends to support the process of depoliticization. And in many cases, the lack of a strong political agenda and societal rooting turns these projects into frames for aggressively market-driven and socially elite interventions, exacerbating a more gentrified urbanization. This inevitably brings up the simple question about how the goods and the bads of ecological interventions are distributed across different social groups. And these questions become especially pertinent when these design rationales stemming from Western academic knowledge are exported to global practice, often into countries where social inequality with regard to ecological infrastructure like water is even more stark. Or worse, when naive ecological design and its designers become a political instrument to intensify social segregation, like in this proposal for the new town near Cape Town, or when the ecological literally washes away informal settlement to give space to the natural course of the water, which is happening all over Asia and Africa. However, we do not have to look at designs located in Africa or Asia to support that argument. A very simple analysis of the latest designs for a city close to my home, Brussels, showcases the disconnect between the design and the political. Design proposals serve the way of greening public space without much consideration of the social context. This is almost like Potemkin covering up 19th century Vienna with a fake facade, and this time it's a green cloth. Facilitating joyful activities like cycling and fairs, while literally covering up challenging neighborhoods like Molenbeek here, which lie in between these green structures and are indeed supposed to develop organically. And at the time this design was presented, these things were happening in these undefined gray structures in between the green. So concluding this quite grim problem definition, it's fair to say that design is only partially equipped to deal with current challenges and is in need of a better understanding of processes of urbanization in relation to socio-political dynamics. Moreover, we are in desperate need, I think, of new imaginaries coupling a strong position on socio-political aims with ecological aims. And I think a promising path would be to ally with different fields in addition to the natural sciences. First, political ecology, second, environmental history and then science and technology studies, and three, aesthetic theory. And there are probably more, but I will have a look at these. So first, political ecology, and I will leave that to Erik, but very short. So I think political ecology can bring in explicit reflection on the political dimension of socio-ecological systems, as well as offer robust methods to analyze and expose the uneven effects of socio-metabolic processes. And more so, it calls for radical urban political ecological imaginaries, in the words of Erik and Maria Kaika. So I will not go into this further, as my knowledge is based on Erik's publications. So I'm very interested in hearing what he has to say. And then second, a stronger engagement with historical precedent, with the history of ecological design in relation to socio-political aims could offer more reflexivity, I think, about, amongst others, the role of the expert. So for example, if we want to frame current design within historical ideas and expertise dealing with uncertainty and environmental threats, the early 19th century is a pretty interesting period. It compares in abstract to the contemporary design context, and it was characterized by a mutually reinforcing combination of a mismatch of permanent architectural form and a rapidly changing urban reality on the one hand, so a disciplinary crisis, and on the other hand, a deep, deep environmental crisis. So the exponentially growing metropolis with social segregation, high crime rates, high poverty rates, and a constant threat of epidemics jeopardize human ecology of the city. And what we see in that period is that expert designs techno-natural infrastructures from a commitment to social imagineering combined with scientific rationales as well as politics. And these experts seldom explicitly articulated their sociopolitical positions, but used the aura of the objective engineer armed with scientific and technical data to their advantage and implicitly inscribed projects about socio-spatial development in these infrastructural projects. So these political projects were not pure radiant ones, but contested ones. The spatial visions that underlie the infrastructures often gave room for socio-spatial projects that aims social justice or social inclusiveness on the one hand, but also social control on the other. So here you can see, for example, rural irrigation projects in around 1840. So planning agricultural colonies. And these designs were really backed by data on biophysical and social factors, transforming the territory to facilitate migration of poor, unemployed urban population to commons, while at the same time decreasing social unrest in the city and increasing rural production to sustain the urban industrial society. So these precedents do certainly not show that it used to be better, but could serve as a thought experiment, which might lead to new ways of conceptualization of the role of the expert, of infrastructure as public works, and more precise definitions about for whom we are designing, and more precise and concrete notions about the public good, about welfare, and ultimately questions about democracy. So, and as a third and final part, it might be promising to reconnect with aesthetic theory. So in current design, the beautiful and the picturesque seem to be dominant, rooted in theories of effect in which continuity and codependency of human and non-human relations are central. And this continuity, as argued before and also argued by Erik, forecloses political reflection and might lead to ethical questionable grounds. So concepts as disinterestedness and categories as the sublime might be able to create a much needed distance between the human and the non-human, between the object and subject. Simply put, in the experience of the sublime, the senses and imagination are incapable of taking in the overwhelming dimensions of the landscape or the event. And the faculty of reason must be engaged. And in so doing, the sublime liberates our judgments from the confines of our own subjectivity, our desires, our self-interests, and confronts us with a thing in itself. The deep and uneven socio-ecological crisis we are in, no matter how frightening and colossal its dimensions are. And this moment of liberation, this moment of disruption, could invite for reflection, maybe even open up a space for a political act. So as a conclusion, let's explore a few questions. Maybe we can pick them up later. So questions about the socio-ecological common. So can the project of the common, can public infrastructure design go beyond competing private or public claims, inject a political project again in design, producing more socially just ecological constellations as a space for both biophysical resilience or social justice? Or will commons be yet again a techno-managerial fix, romanticizing local intervention, a reproduction of boundaries between the haves and the have-nots. And shouldn't we start with a political imaginary, something that Erik calls communism, before forwarding concrete solutions? And then second, the technocratic image. So how do we position ourselves as experts? Are we comfortable with being obedient to politics, not questioning design briefs and being inscribed into the obscure processes of depoliticization? Or do we shake off the modernist trauma and claim authorship again, formulate strong and indeed radical political vision? Or is the pragmatic approach more efficient? Is it possible to find a middle position and use the aura of objectivity to our benefit? And then the final one, the socio-natural ideal. Shouldn't we question the implicit collapse between nature and society in socio-ecological design and discourses on sustainability in general, and rethink the practice of extracting ecological systems without formulating sociopolitical vision? And should we question ideas on co-adaptive, co-evolutionary dynamics, basically returning to conservative and potentially dangerous conceptions about the natural construction of society? Should we instead incorporate political ecology's analysis of the social construction of nature and search for additional tools, ensuring distance between the descriptive and the prescriptive, between the analysis and the project, between the subject and the object? Tools like the sublime that allow the controversial and contradictory to be part of the experience and invites, in the words of Mustafa Dikesh, a reflective withdrawal from the normalized spaces and practices by opening up new spaces. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Grit. Usually there is a clap at this moment, so I invite everybody to to thank Grit for this very strong starting. And yeah, I think, do you think it's good that we immediately continue to Erik, or maybe students you would like to start to give, say, 5 minutes for the first reaction to Grit?
Are there any reactions? Yeah. First one.
Hi, thanks a lot for the presentation. I had a question to draw a parallel between Haraway's statement about how we approach ecology, Donna Haraway's statement that you mentioned, and drawing its parallel with the idea of sublime. So when Haraway calls to action this idea of bringing the human and non-human closer to each other, would you say that it is more towards the sublime theories instead of the aesthetic theories, or can we sort of understand, using her example, the difference between I'm trying to understand the difference between the aesthetic, because I read the paper that was talking about this, that was criticizing Mayer's approach on aesthetic ways of approaching the human non-human distance, but moving towards the sublime approach. And if we could use Haraway's call for action as an example for making this distinction.
Yeah, for me, Haraway is an example of not creating the systems of a collapse, of setting up this strong entanglement between the human and non-human, which I understand. I understand the reasoning, but I think we should be really carefully to follow that post-human turn, and critically when we are doing territorial interventions. So no, I wouldn't mobilize Haraway. I wouldn't use her as an example. No.
Maybe other reactions?
Yeah, Valentin, I have to tell you something that I don't know, the micro or the distance you have to the micro is not really very clear. So maybe you have to take the micro a little bit more far from your. Also, Ashkar, it's also a little bit difficult to understand your what you were saying. So the micro is not perfect. So just consider that we don't hear perfect in a good way, but
okay,
maybe you have to maintain it. Okay. Are there other comments or? That's not yet the debate, but just to react, let's say.
maybe we can continue with Erik's presentation.
Okay. So,
all right. Good evening. I'm happy to be back in Lausanne, albeit in a virtual way this time. It's a pity that I could not travel to your beautiful city this time around for all sorts of reasons. It's a pleasure also to be on the same panel with Great, who I've known for many years now. We've co-supervised PhDs, etc. And it's always a pleasure to listen to her and a tough act to follow. She already gave a devastating critique of the use of a particular scientific understanding of nature as a self-organizing system and the consequences of that when that is uncritically mobilized in new design theory that then is strictly parallel or fits well in a neoliberal ideology and contributes to what I've called in the first week of this seminar series a post-political or post-democratic configuration. Also, with respect to the final suggestion about the sublime and maintaining a separation, it reminded me of the work of Frédéric Neyrat, who makes a case for what he calls an ecology of separation, rather than an ecology of entanglement of the kind that Donna Haraway suggests. And I do think the COVID epidemic is, in fact, a very good illustration of exactly the perverse limitations of a call for an intimate relationality with the non-human, because we do know from the pandemic that an intimate embodied relationality is socially highly triaged. It kills some and doesn't kill others. So with respect to politics of the coronavirus, I think an ecology of separation is precisely what is required. Now, Great looked at the question of cities and ecology from a design perspective. I'm going to shift the tack and look at the same sort of question or issue from the perspective of urban social theory. So I'm going to start to share my screen with you now. Which one is it? This one. So the title of my talk is Politicizing the Urbanization of Natures. In the original title, I put nature, but really nature does not exist. What we call nature is a collage of all sorts of human and non-human things. We cannot collapse elephants with COVID viruses and mountains, etc. That's why I would prefer to call it politicizing the urbanization of natures. And what I'm really interested in that is not in the first place the relationship between nature or the non-human in cities, that is the relationship between cities on the one hand and the non-human on the other. I'm really much more interested in the question of the urbanization of natures. How is the non-human and how does the non-human becomes enrolled, both socially as well as physically, in the process that we call urbanization? For me, the city is not a thing, of course, but a process. Let me just give a few examples of how the non-human becomes urban and is an integral part of the making of the process of urbanization. and the construction of the city. Take, for example, your mobile phone. I think most of you sitting there could not imagine even life any longer without a mobile phone in your pocket. Is there anyone in the room who does not have a mobile phone? Is there anyone in the room who does not think that IT platforms and infrastructures are vital to produce both a sustainable and livable city? Exactly. So what I would like to invite you to do is to excavate, become an archaeologist of your mobile phone and do or reconstruct the architecture of your mobile phone. Would you not very quickly find yourself in the socio-ecological dystopian heartlands of Columbine tantalite extraction around the Great Lakes in Africa? Is it the case that each time you buy a new mobile phone, you put a Kalashnikov in the hand of a black kid somewhere in Africa trying to protect the mines through which the coltan is generated? That makes your mobile phone do the things it does. Or consider, for example, 400 ppm. 400 ppm stands for the magical concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And 400 parts per million of CO2 is the highest concentration of CO2 ever recorded on Earth. That was at a time when the dinosaurs were walking through the streets of Lausanne. Today, I checked yesterday, the global concentration of greenhouse gases is about 415 ppm. We are now literally in the future. We are in uncharted terrain. The Earth never had this concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And of course, again, it's the urbanization process that is for 80% responsible for emitting greenhouse gases. Or finally, consider the politics of the urbanization of nature, something that some have called the new green imperialism, where we can sustain our lifestyles in Lausanne or Antwerp or Amsterdam, where I'm sitting now, by buying carbon permits that permit our industries to pump out CO2 if it is compensated for with the production of carbon sinks somewhere else, usually in the global south. So we're condemning the global south to being our green carbon sink and the socio-ecological conditions associated with that, so that our urban lives can continue. So these are the sort of issues that I'm interested in when I think of the process of the urbanization of nature. Now the question is how to politicize the urbanization of nature. And that sounds easy, but it's quite difficult to do. And urban theory has not been very helpful. So I'm going to say something about the curious case, what I would consider to be the curious case of 20th century urban theory and practice. To then move on to a moment of eureka about 20 or 30 years ago, in which we again discovered the centrality of the non-human in the making and remaking of cities. Thirdly, I'll then very quickly say how that moment of insight, what Grit referred to as political ecological analysis, how it really failed completely to inflect the trajectory of socio-ecological urban change. And I blame you, designers and architects, in part for that. So we're in a deadlock today. And I'll say something about that deadlock that we're in, to then consider the kind of questions and issues, and somewhat in parallel to what Grit said, about possible new beginnings. What I mean by the strange case of 20th century urban studies is that the non-human was strangely completely absent from most, if not all, of urban theory and practice as an explicit concern throughout the 20th century, precisely during a century when there was an extraordinary intensification of the urbanization of all manner of non-human stuff, of all manner of ecologies. In fact, the non-human, the ecological, became scripted out of urban theory and urban practice, which was actually not the case with 19th century urban sociology avant la lettre. There's been a strange removal of the non-human from urban theory. Think of the 19th century, I've here a few examples. The Condition of the Working Class in England by Friedrich Engels, this kind of masterpiece of ethnographic sociological analysis of a city, in the industrial city in the mid-19th century. He was acutely aware of the ecological, the socio-ecological configuration of a class-organized city. He described in great detail the intimate relationship between women's bodies, bacteria, and rats. He described in intimate detail the relationship between the direction of winds and the location of housing. And it's not difficult to see where, if you live in Manchester, you'd find the elite houses and where you would find the proletarian houses, depending on dominant wind directions. And of course, Marx himself was also acutely aware of how social relations are always organized in and through the way in which the non-human is appropriated, metabolized, and distributed. And he coined this notion of metabolic lift, the metabolic lift that we're still very much living with today. When I gave the example of your iPhone, the coltan becomes moved while metabolized in your iPhone sitting in Lausanne. And next year, when you buy the next generation one, it will move again to the suburbs, the shantytowns of Delhi or Dakar for recycling in the suburban informal settlements. So there's a gigantic metabolic shift and metabolic lift going on in the process of urbanization. It's nothing else than a massive process of shifting, both geographically, over time, but also in its physical, social configuration, all manner of non-human stuff. And of course, the late 19th century urban sanitation movement, the great moment that urban planning established itself, urban design established itself as a profession and a discipline to the urban sanitation movement, was really about sustainability avant la lettre, because it was not named as such at the time. So all that concern that was deeply present in socio-ecological theory in the 19th century disappeared throughout the 20th century. If you look at the great schools of urban theory in the 20th century, they were completely denaturalized, although strangely enough, often based on ecological concepts and metaphors. Take the Chicago School as its classic. The Chicago School borrowed its key concept. It was the first real theory of urban organization, urban change, the Chicago School of Urban Theory. Borrowed its concepts and metaphors from the natural sciences, but evacuated nature completely from its theorizations. The same happened, of course, later on, the post-war period, in urban modeling. And indeed also with the critical revolution, when the Marxist revival appeared in the 60s, 1970s, with names like Lefebvre, Castells, Harvey, Massey, etc., the non-human was also strangely absent from these most radical of gestures. And that was still maintained in much of post-Marxist critical urban thinking, urban feminist thinking, urban post-structural, post-colonial, etc. It was both theories of that depoliticized urban matters, but also denaturalized urbanity. So that is quite interesting. This is a problematic that I don't have time to go into now, is what needs to be grappled with is not the view that nature and urbanization are deeply intertwined. I would argue that every idiot knows that. You don't need to be a university educated designer or sociologist to know that. But in fact, how and why theorizing and practicing urban development and change, how that became predicated upon separating nature and society in thought, theory, and practice. But we've moved on. From the 1970s, 1980s onwards, the non-human began to drip into urban theoretical and design concerns again. And not because of theoretical reasons or political reasons, but because it pushed itself on the agenda. It pushed itself on the agenda through a number of socio-ecological change, the emergence of a increasingly vocal ecological movement. For those old enough to remember how nuclear energy in the 1970s became, as it were, the symptomatic point that embodied the beginning of what we would today call a socio-ecological movement. I grew up as a political ecologist by protesting as a young academic in the fields of Flanders and Holland and France against yet a new nuclear reactor. We are close to winning, except that so many climate activists now tend to think that nuclear energy will help us save the planet from overheating. That is the irony of irony, I think. But of course, there was also the Club of Rome's argument, whereby the specter of resource depletion began to be staged as this dystopian possibility that our civilization could not go on because of nature's limitations. And then, of course, the galloping process of urbanization, particularly in the global south, where the rapid expansion, hyper-urbanization, led to a condition in which everyone began to see the urban in the global south as a socio-ecological problem. So it's around that time that David Harvey, is just one among many others, began to argue that in fact there is nothing unnatural about the city, that the city is ultimately nothing else than the outcome of and the arena through which nature becomes urbanized. So what I want to quickly do is to go through three theoretical perspectives with also practical implications of how the non-human, the environment, the ecological began to be incorporated within urban theory and associated practices. The first one I'm going to be very quick about because everyone knows about that. That seems to be the dominant, the hegemonic one, and the one I would argue we should forget as quickly as possible. It's the notion of urban sustainability, urban sustainable development, ultimately based on a view, a fantasy, that a socio-ecological, urban, cohesive, ecologically sane urbanity is possible within the present socio-economic configurations. That began to emerge after the late 80s, early 90s, and is still the dominant view. It is possible through techno-managerial means to marry the human and the non-human such that both the human and the non-human can live in harmony, pretty much based on a fantasy that if you leave nature on its own, it is harmonious, stable, dynamic, and complex. I think that the COVID virus is curing us from this imaginary fantasy that nature left to itself is harmonious, superior, and ecologically fine if left untouched or if taken care of. The sustainable urbanity argument is based fundamentally on two interconnected views. On the one hand, there is the notion of ecological rationality. The Green New Deal is very much an illustration of that. The argument basically is we have been squandering nature until we became aware of the infernal consequences of that squandering. So what we need to do is have a more rational, efficient use of our resources. The notion of a circular economy, the kind of other fantasy that is continuously being offered, is pretty much based on the view that we can, through technical, scientific means, organize the mobilization of nature in an efficient way such that we can happily coexist. It is basically the view that is very much sustained by eco-technocratic and ecological modernization perspectives. And I would argue that most of the design and architectural eco-design principles and practices that I encounter are very much situated in that domain. It occasionally, this perspective occasionally pays attention to the wider socio-ecological networks and conflicts and compromises that are involved in delivering urban sustainability, but nonetheless is predicated upon an imaginary fantasy, that is the possibility of a certain harmony that can be achieved through a particular scientific understanding of nature. Nature understood as singular, ordered, and inherently harmonious. This perspective also radically, although it occasionally pays lip service to it, but theoretically and practically silences the questions of inequality and inequity. It disavows the centrality of inequality in the making of socio-ecological complexes. The second perspective is about urban environmental injustices, or what is usually referred to as the environmental justice movement. I assume that most of you have heard of it. The environmental justice movement would very much emerge as an urban movement in the United States, was particularly concerned with and detailed to great empirical extent the racialized organization of socio-ecological goods and bads. One of the nice examples was a study in Chicago. Someone who calculated the number of glass particles in children's playgrounds per square meter and mapped that out according to the racialized pattern of Chicago. It's not difficult to see, of course, in what kind of playgrounds you would find the highest percentage of glass particles per square meter in children's playgrounds. Classic example of environmental injustice. So it originated very much in the United States and was very much concerned with questions of distribution. How are the socio-ecological goods and bads distributed to the various components and layers of urban society? We can ask the question in the context of the urbanization of COVID, how the embodiment of the COVID virus is socially triaged through very clear distributional means. I have been living during the pandemic in splendid isolation. No chance to get infected, which is very different from those for whom the COVID pandemic was just an unfortunate inconvenience. The healthcare workers, the logistical workers, those who brought my food, delivered food on the door here, who delivered my groceries and other stuff, my books through Amazon, etc. They died 4 times as often as my kind. That's the sort of questions of environmental justice and injustice that the urban environmental justice movement keeps on insisting on. How are the non-human goods and bads socially distributed? And what are the power mechanisms through which that distribution is organized? So they at least pay already much greater attention to the social process by which the non-human gets urbanized, and the deep triaging that takes place in the very process of urbanizing the non-human. As I already suggested, it focuses on questions of justice. Justice as a distributional issue, very much in the Rawlsian sense of distributional justice. And is primarily concerned with patterns of social, spatial, environmental injustice. Who has access to good ecologies and who suffers from the presence of bad ecologies? And really take seriously the notion that natures are radically heterogeneous. I don't like a cat, I don't mind a cat around me, but I don't want a rat around me. So the good natures, bad natures, and they are differentially distributed. And that's deeply visible in the patterning of the urban, and comes to the fore in extreme ways in processes of environmental gentrification. Have you been to the High Line in Manhattan? For those who are familiar with the High Line in Manhattan as a clear example of ecological gentrification. The third perspective is urban geopolitical ecology. Urban geopolitical ecology is not so much concerned with the distribution of socio-ecological goods and bads, but is more concerned with the production, the making of socio-environmental inequalities through, and how these inequalities are produced, created through the particular social mechanism through which human and non-human stuff gets assembled together. So natures, the argument goes, natures of a variety of kind become increasingly enrolled in processes of economic development, urbanization, urban capital accumulation, in a process, a circulation process that is a metabolic one. Now, metabolism in this context has to be understood as the process whereby physical matter, such as H2O, such as cows, such as coltan, are transformed into usable, ownable, and tradable commodities. And through that, new environments become produced. In this sense, there is nothing unnatural about a skyscraper, just a metabolized assemblage of sand, water, steel, and a variety of other things. And it's that through which a range of inequalities become constituted. So this process that I just described is predicated upon the continuous incorporation of natures, the non-human, within social relations of property and of ownership. Who owns it? Who has access to it? Who has the right to appropriate it? And that operates very much through a process of commodification, the very strange process of commodification of nature. Now think about it. Every square inch of the earth, almost every non-human thing, except for air and some of the oceans, is commodified, that is owned with exclusive rights and can only be accessed through monetary exchange. I think this is a very weird thing that really needs to be understood and grappled with and not taken as a naturalized configuration. Now, large-scale urbanization, urban political ecologists argue, large-scale urbanization of all manners of nature is the spatial form of capital accumulation. So our society, economically and socially, is predicated upon the large-scale urbanization of all manners of nature, with all manner of unintended outcomes and unacknowledged outcomes. Urban political ecology is radically anti-Malthusian. The Malthusian view is the one that says that there are not enough resources because we are with too many people. Urban political ecology radically rejects that. For political ecology, scarcity is socially produced. It's socially produced to the twin imperative of growth for growth's sake and the market as the allocation instrument. So, for example, in many cities in the global south, half of the population does not have access to sufficient clean and potable water. It's the #1 cause of premature mortality in the world. That is, people who die because they have to die. That has nothing to do with some sort of scarcity of water on Earth, but has everything to do with money power in individual and collective pockets to organize the metabolism of water. So thirdly, the urban socio-physical environment, whether it's a park, a building, an infrastructure, embodies and reflects the power relationships that are inscribed in socio-ecological metabolism. As Fred suggests, the science and technology study is extremely good at doing that. Give me a pipe and I'll show you the power relationships through which the transformation of nature is organized. That's basically the tenet. And finally, of course, state, governance, policies, and politics matter. Class and other forms of social power, gender, ethnic, racialized, or inscribed in this. So that's fantastic. I think many of you would agree that such an urban political ecological perspective opens up not just a new understanding of the way in which to understand urban ecologies, but also opens up a new politicized way of thinking about nature, the city, and ecology. Unfortunately, it's not the case. We now know a lot about the political ecological metabolism of urbanization. Plenty of academic work of great quality has been done over doing political ecologies of urbanization, around infrastructure, water, waste, garbage, heat, food, CO2, disease, resource flows, coltan, you name it. I'll find you a few very, very good books and academic work. What has been its impact? Zero. We are now capable of tracing socio-ecological metabolic flows, the social inequalities inscribed in it, and how it comes together in urbanity. What does it do to urban design and practice? Zero. We are fully aware of how the commodification, the neoliberalization of nature produces this kind of double movement that Polanyi described 50 years ago. That is how, on the one hand, the increasing commodification that is rendering nature, the non-human, into a private property corresponds or is parallel with major ecological conflict and struggle. That there's massive discontent around this. In what ways is this discontent, this disagreement, these conflicts reflected in design theory and practice? I'm still waiting to see it, with a few exceptions here and there. So how can we really politicize urban ecologies? And that will be my concluding statement. So This body of thought, urban political ecology, of which I'm a proud member of this subdiscipline or this perspective, this body of thought has paid relatively little attention to the political opportunities that such perspective could bring, or to imagining, as Schreed also insisted on, to imagining radical, different urban socio-ecological assemblages. So although we are now able to trace, chart, follow, and narrate the multiple uneven socio-ecological lines that shape the urban process, preciously little has been said about how to produce alternative, more equitable, and enabling in an inclusive way urban socio-ecological assemblages. In other words, we do not take our own arguments seriously. We do not take our own knowledges seriously. So as Mark Whitehead argued, what is required is a political methodology of urban nature. And why that is important is because the world today, the urban world, a world of planetary urbanization, is in a deadlock. We're all acutely aware of the ecological nightmare that is unfolding and that is getting worse from day to day, not for us sitting in Lausanne, Antwerp, and Amsterdam is quite fine. But for many of the world's urban population, the ecological, socio-ecological condition under which they have to live are lethal. There is the galloping process of planetary urbanization that is sustained by the increasing and deepening universalization of the commodification of nature, and consequently the process of what David Harvey has dubbed as the accumulation of dispossession of nature. Soon, Lausanne will undoubtedly have electrical vehicles running through its hilly topography in order to save the planet from overheating, and in the name of sustainability. Well, we all know, of course, that this is predicated upon dispossessing the peasants and indigenous people of Latin America from access to water and land, because lithium is underneath it that is required to build the batteries to produce our sustainable cities. And the consensualization of the ecological conundrum that has happened over the past 20, 30 years or so, and which became hegemonically structured around what Schreed dubbed as a techno-managerial, and what I would agree with too, a techno-managerial perspective, has really failed dismally to take seriously the socio-ecological predicament that we're in. That's why I would argue we need a political theory of political ecology. And also, and I'm going to conclude by giving a few pointers. I don't have an answer to it, but I can at least try to give a few pointers. But the best pointers, I think, are set by those hundreds and thousands of people in different places around the world who are not sitting in the lofty theaters of highly paid university degree programs, but who know that their everyday lives depend on how nature is urbanized and continuously fight around this. Remember, to take just one example, Taksim Square in Istanbul in 2013, 2014, how this great politicizing struggle, which failed, but nonetheless was a great politicizing struggle, how that unfolded over 300 trees and a badly designed shopping mall. So we need, I would argue, a different intellectual and political agenda. One that articulates around thinking through how to re-politicize urban political ecology, how we can move from a concern with urban environmental management and sometimes impotent forms of acting out to really staging and reorganizing equality in an ecologically sensible way, because that is what politics is all about. Political ecology, if you put the emphasis on the political, not on the ecological, is indeed about equality, about commonality, the commons, as Great also suggested, and solidarity. Does that still have a role to play today? Or should we just shut up and build some houses? That's fine too, but let's shut up about the possibility of a socio-ecological alternative. In other words, we can't have our cake and eat it. So there are a few things that we might, and I'm going to conclude, we might pay somewhat greater attention to the fact that the promised dystopian future because of environmental change is a fantasy. The reality of the situation is that the apocalypse is combined and uneven. Or to put more differently, that the reality of the situation is that we, our type and our cities, buy our and build our sustainability at the cost of producing unsustainability elsewhere. It's what my Viennese colleague Ingelfrid Bludorn calls the sustainability of unsustainability. I would suggest that many of the eco-technological design practices that many architects are after and that produce indeed more sensible worlds in one place, produce a socio-ecological nightmare elsewhere. I think that needs to be foregrounded. Secondly, the continuous contestation of the process of what I would call post-neoliberalization. Post-neoliberalization is the process by which the mobilization of nature to be incorporated in market forces is not only relegated to the private sector, it's the state itself. It's public governance itself that becomes a key component in the continuous privatization and commodification of nature with its infernal socio-ecological consequences. China is a very good case here, where you have a wonderful assemblage between the state and private agents in ransacking the ecologies of the world to sustain its process of urbanization called Shanghai or Beijing or Wuhan. We might also want to consider what it means to be concerned with the environment, whether it is from local neighborhoods to activism, etc. And where indeed much of the urban ecological activism and endeavors are very much articulated around the thought of NIMBY, not in my backyard. I don't want a waste dump in my backyard. I don't want a COVID virus in my body. I don't want fossil fuel pumping cars in my neighborhood. That's NIMBYism. That is not the same as working for a different socio-ecological urbanity. So I think we have to think about how we can move from a situation that is inflected by a concern of not in my backyard to what I would call NIABI, not in anyone's backyard. And that comes with a radically different set of principles, technologies, and management ideas. And then finally, I think we have to continue to destabilize the way in which nature, quote unquote, is being imagined, discursively represented, and fantasized. As Alain Badiou put it eloquently a few years ago, ecology, he says, is today the new opium of the people. The view that if we can deal in a technical, rational, managerial way with the external conditions of urban life, we will produce simultaneously an ecologically sensible and socially just world. Of course, that is a lie. The reducing carbon, say, from the atmosphere does not produce a socially just and environmentally sensible environment. It requires a different way of imagining what nature's is all about. And it requires a different way of thinking about how we collectively produce the socio-ecological entanglements that we wish to inhabit. Because isn't it ultimately the task of design to produce socio-ecological, socio-natural entanglements of a variety of kinds? Isn't then the question, who does that production and for whom? And that is ultimately a political question. So to conclude, what we indeed need, and I echo what Fred said too, we need to develop radical new socio-ecological imaginaries. And is that not precisely, not just the intellectual task, but the intellectual obligation of those who seek to dwell in the intellectual space of how to produce new environments? And should we not take heed of what Frederick Jameson said now a long time ago, that it is indeed these days easier to imagine the end of the world than even minor changes in the eco-capitalist order that we inhabit and its corresponding inequities. That's it. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't speak too long.
Thank you very much. So I see already, I know the clapping. Please, if there are questions, raise your hand physically or digitally, but show yourself. And in the meantime, while you are reflecting, I just want to thank Grit and Erik for the very intense lectures. Very intense, very beautiful, very happy that you did it. That of course are always very, they struck us. They are very, very strong, and they oblige us to think about what we do as urban designers. But as I said to Erik, and maybe we should go back to this point maybe at the end, Erik has to understand where we designers are. Grit has a better understanding of the ambiguity of our role, and I think it's quite fundamental that we can have this kind of conversations, because I think we need to I don't know, to organize a kind of support to this category of the designers that are there in the middle, in the frontier between speculations and forms of power, and we are really there. And at the same time, we can imagine, we can try to imagine radical new futures. We can do, but at the same time, we are not satisfied of doing this in a kind of only academic field, and to introduce this level of radicality in the everyday life of designers. I think this is what is really missing, and where we would need to, I don't know, to reinforce arguments, reinforce the capacity to bring reasons that can make this kind of, put this distance and change and help to change the way in which the different actors that are inside in this kind of transformation can eventually appropriate and can start to open new horizons, which are clearly necessary today. So on one side, we had grit, making this strong criticism, very, very open, explicit criticisms to certain tendencies that use, say, eco, like a label of a new politically correct type of design. And on the other side, Erik, that continued in this deconstruction, and that concludes with this invitation to create new imaginaries. And when we speak of new imaginaries, I think that designers, what they think this is also a call to them. So let's see if the students can a little bit start to react. Please bring also your doubts. It's important that we involve a little bit people like Erik, but Greta knows already, but especially Erik, that we involve a little bit Erik also in the difficulties that we have, and how we can use some of the categories, some of the concepts that are proposed to,
Can I just quickly say,
please.
say something? Yes, I always feel to be in a very luxurious situation, because I am not in a discipline where I am forced to build an actual space. So at the same time, I'm envious of designers. On the other hand, I feel in a luxury position that I do not have to dwell in that middle space that you quite rightly pointed out to. However, at the same time, I want to say that although we do need new imaginaries, as Grit suggested, there are some formidable imaginaries from the past that are completely scripted out from. I'm sitting in Amsterdam, yes, and I'm sure most planners are familiar with Berlage and his famous Amsterdam plan. He did the impossible in a particular geopolitical context. He housed thousands and thousands and thousands of people in a qualitatively high environment that is now, of course, one of the great attractions for gentrifying Amsterdam. But at that time was considered to be impossible. The way in which many, many architects and planners in the past, together with the political agents supporting it, have been housing hundreds of thousands of people, yes, in a situation today where there is big urgency. I do not see much of that emerging. How can these old ideas be repackaged imaginatively within the realities of today, which is the design of the social and the common again, rather than design of the particular and the individual, which it seems to me is what is mostly happening today.
And it's very interesting what you are saying, because a few days ago on Monday, we discussed with the students exactly of Amsterdam South, so the Berlage neighborhoods. And but Berlage, as well as many others, they were, say, the relation between Berlage and the socio-democratic regime was different from the relation we have today with not the different forms of that are in fact asking designers to do things. The context is different, and that's why I think we need really to bring together your questions together with the way in which the transformation is ongoing, in order to we need to break this actual order and to open to something that can integrate some of the categories you're doing. But I will bring back this question at the end. I don't want to monopolize now the discussion. Maybe Greta, you want to say something in reaction?
Well, I second Erik's intervention. Probably I'm going to agree with Erik all the time, but I do think designers are in a different position these days. But on the other hand, I also we had this huge disciplinary crisis, and our position has been shaky for a long time. But I think at this point, as we look at the huge territorial projects that the designers are again in charge of, I think we can shake it off. I think we are again as a discipline strong enough to be disobedient.
In some context. In some context,
that's true. But what is a bit strange to me is if you look at the 70s or way back, 60s, 50s, well, and so forth. But at a certain point, disobedience was the default practice. So not following design briefs.
Mm-hmm. It didn't work. Great.
Yeah, I would like to see more of that again. Yeah.
No, of course, but we have also to understand that what has been said in the 70s has been forgotten.
It's true.
What were already said in the 70s. It was already clear, very clear. All the questions were already there. They were justly made evident, explicit by a lot of scholars. They disappeared completely. And now we are reconstructing on that desert. So yes, of course, we need that kind of exercise, but this is not enough. I think we have to...
So is that not an indication of the absolute failure of the intellectual configuration of planning, design, etc.? That is the willful forgetting of its own history. In other words, have we not, and I see this in my discipline too, have we, intellectuals and academics, not actively contributed to that amnesia and silencing of the past, and have too much settled in accepting the assumedly externally given conditions that forced us allegedly in a particular sort of way, and began to teach and instruct our students precisely to operate in that space that was given and that could not be changed. Is it not the task of a university, not of a design office? A design office has to make a profit, I understand that. And they have to be the lackeys of the king. I understand that. I would be too if I would be a consultant.
I don't agree with that. Okay,
but not in a university, not in academia. That is a different thing. When I'm a consultant, I get paid to prostitute my brains, and I'm happy to do so. I actually have done so and continue to do so, but I'm acutely aware that that is precisely what I'm doing. We at universities should not do that.
Sorry, Erik, I respect what you are saying, but I do not agree. I do not agree.
We have an argument. That's good. That's a debate.
If you construct this division between an academy that is free, can do whatever they like, they can take fun, this is not, for me, educating students. On the other hand, an office has not to make a profit, has to survive. That's something different than to make a profit. Has to survive. The profit, let's the profit for a moment on one side.
I'm happy with that.
There is an implication, there is an engagement. And if you establish a division between what you learn at the university and the reality, that's dramatic. That's dramatic. That's why I'm saying that.
I'm saying exactly the opposite. My argument
exactly, but then we're saying
my argument is that there is an amnesia going on, that we do not speak the truth to our students. And that is a willful amnesia, precisely because speaking the truth would in a certain way make the kind of things that we assume they have to do in order to survive more difficult. So we are silenced about that. We do not speak up about that. And that is, I think, a problem.
Okay,
there is a reaction here in the...
Exactly, let's conclude for the moment here and really open to the students.
Does this micro work? Yeah.
Yeah, better than before.
Okay, so I wanted to react to what you said now, but also actually before during the lecture, Erik, you said that it's a problem today that all these academic texts and everything is just written and forgotten. So then in the academy that you were just talking, that the academy has the freedom of research and looking for new ways of doing. I mean, if the academy is not, the university is not the place to test out new strategy and to try out new things, where should we try them out? I think it's a bit a question for both of you for the discussion you just had, but if we don't try this out in the academy, because a project is a kind of a prophecy, no? Because every project we do is a kind of imaginary for the future. And in the academy, in the university, we have to train students, persons, to try to imagine a better future or how we could go forth. So if we do not let them have the freedom to this creativity, how can we advance as a society?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the academy is a place to test, to experiment, to do wild thinking. I've been to many design schools and did a lot of studio reviews, like for example in the GSD and the schools that I named, and I saw not that much wild thinking. It was very sophisticated. It's often super sophisticated, technically brilliant work, but the imagination, the thing that you are actually really good at as architects, is often not lacking, but seems to be less important than its technical sophistication.
Yeah, I agree with you here. Again, it's of course extraordinary what is happening in design schools in terms of this technologically sophisticated and often very wild yet interesting thinking. But it is of a very particular kind. And it's not only in academia that there is all manner of experimentation going on. There is in everyday life all manner of experimentation going on. It's not that difficult to see how what I call insurgent architects, I used that word in my first seminar, how all manner of communities in a variety of ways are trying to construct a new way of living, acting, and operating together, in which the construction of a commons of a certain way, a geographical, ecological, socio-ecological commons is at stake. How do you design that? Now, what kind of, in addition to the extraordinary big data, technologically sophisticated designs, etc., where are the institutional and social designs that would point in a direction that supports the extraordinary creativities that are being lived out, not in academia, but in the real world out there? I would like to see a much greater symbiosis between the creativity that is going on in real life and that by designers. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, I went to a design exhibition. Architects, can't remember where, but it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. One of the projects was a design for the refugee camp. And of course, I thought, no, given the horrible situation that you see in Lesbos and other places, and I was extremely impressed by the extraordinary quality of the design, the sensitivity to the conditions in the refugee camp. At the same time, I was horrified how the best minds in design can only think about how to upgrade a refugee camp, a concentration camp. That is what I mean by not taking into consideration alternative ways of doing it. How do you design together with refugees who are fighting for citizenship, for an asylum space? Now they have to use a bloody church in Brussels. They have to use a church. And they do it effectively with the priest. What about you guys and girls doing a great design of a refugee that would include the technical, the managerial, the legal configuration? That would be interesting. I would like to see that. How to produce an asylum space in which everyone can live and dwell, not a hyper-designed refugee camp. And that was proposed as a kind of progressive, inclusive, radical imaginary. And I think, oh my God, that's a radical imaginary that supports the status quo.
Yeah, exactly.
There is another question here. Yeah, maybe one here.
To pick up on the amnesia that Matteo was talking about, do you think that the amnesia is escalated by discrepancy between experiments in the university and experiments in the urban? Because, for example, I did my thesis on the fact that the knowledge in the university does not reach the urban, that the knowledge in the urban does not reach the university. Can the amnesia be also a fact that there is no real platform between these two institutions? Well, not between the institution of the university and the urban platform.
Well, that's of course an eternal question for which there is no easy and immediate answer. How to articulate the relationships and the communication between different ways of doing and speaking. And that's an endless task, and we all try in a variety of ways to facilitate discursive encounter. But I don't think that's where the amnesia comes from. I think the amnesia is in ourselves. That I think is the deepest problem. In the following sense, to summarize that, despite the fact we know very well the truth of the situation, despite the fact we know very well what the fact is, we act as if we do not know. That is what Lacanian psychoanalysis calls fetishistic disavowal. And that's a willful amnesia, because if you were to fully acknowledge the knowing and the acting, our ways of living, our cherished way of living would disintegrate. And that would be too traumatic an experience, too traumatic a trajectory to go. So I think the problem resides as much in us internally as it resides in the articulation between different instances of thinking and doing.
Picking up on the last comment that you made on the refugee camps, and when we discuss socio-ecological injustices, it's peculiar that the injustices are planetary. When we discuss Dhaka and Amsterdam together, the socio-ecological injustices are planetary, but the largest scale at which sort of designers, or at least we are working at, is of a territory. And hence, there is this divide between how do you deal with injustices that are inherently planetary, and the politics is intercontinental, international. But what you deal with is two districts sitting next to each other, which has almost the same level of, obviously there are inherent injustices at that scale as well. But then how do you equip yourself to go beyond theories to actually solve a planetary level of injustice?
I think it's quite easy, actually. It's always pitted as one against the other, the territorial, which is the domain of the designer, the architect, the policymaker too. than always dealing with a particular place, territory, neighborhood, building, etc., and the global flows of things. Well, let's take that into consideration in our designs. And it's really not that difficult if we surrender our amnesia. I have many conversations with my architect friends in Manchester at the Architecture Institute. All of them, without exception, are concerned with the ecological situation. All of them are interested in carbon emissions, etc., and all of them are looking for the holy grail of carbon neutral or environmentally neutral designs. That's the wet dream of every architect designer these days that I encounter. Now, what they do systematically is to accept the fetishism of their own object. They design a house or whatever it is, calculate, and the calculations are, as Grit said, very sophisticated, very, very multi-dimensional, big data analysis, but territorial, always territorial. I've never seen a design that claims to be ecologically sensitive, that does the environmental calculations of its particular thing on a flow basis. Right? If you design an electrical car, yes, you can say, well, this is producing 0 greenhouse gases in the city. That's what they say, correct. But no one looks at, no one does a multi-data, big data analysis of the metabolic flow with its socio-ecological patterning that makes this electrical car come into being and to be sustained. And that is true for the park, that's true for the house, that's true for a neighborhood. So I maintain that it is very easy methodologically, technically, and on the basis of existing data and information to do a completely different accounting of our design principle. So we should give up on our stuckness in the territory, although of course that is precisely whether we have to intervene, but that territory and what we do with it extends in its making and functioning, extends a global reach, which with our contemporary computing and investigative possibilities is easy to map. Do it next time you think of an ecological design. And I would have much less to talk about in terms of critique. So that is the way in which I think the two can be articulated. It doesn't solve the problem, but at least articulate. A few weeks ago, months ago now, I was sitting here in Amsterdam with designers and planners. They want to green the city. Amsterdam is one of the greenest cities after Oslo. Yeah. They want to have 50% of the energy production from windmills. They already have 35% of electricity produced through windmills. And I was sitting there and I raised my hand at some point. I said, have you ever thought of where those windmills come from? The ecological disaster that the production of windmills does in Africa. They looked at me as if I came from another planet in total panic because they have to sell this wind energy to the Amsterdam liberal green population as a liberal green project, and it's a great idea. But you can't then say that these windmills are actually causing eco-suicide and ecocide in other parts of the world. And I do think that every design intervention should at least make explicit the socio-ecological inequities conflicts and tensions that are invariably, of necessity, embedded in any sort of intervention. And at a moment like that, at least it's possible to politicize it, because it forces you to take sides that way or that way. And you move away from this kind of consensual view that electrical vehicles are good for the city and the planet, while we all know they're not. And that's true for most eco-technical managerial interventions. They're always good for some people in some places, and for some natures in some places, and it's bad for some natures in other places, some people in other places. I don't think it's that difficult to make that an integral part of the truth of a design story. I talk too much.
Maybe is there any question on the Zoom? If not, Matteo, you wanted to add something, maybe? On the Zoom, don't hesitate to raise your hand digitally.
Actually, it was quite about what you just talked right now. But before in the lecture, you said that ecology is the new opium.
Yeah.
So opium in this sense, like how the British used opium in China, or
No. Although it's similar, it's in a way similar. I had rather in mind Karl Marx's statement in the 19th century when he said that religion is the opium for the people. Alain Badiou, notorious French Marxist philosopher, that replaced religion with ecology as the new opium for the people. And what he suggested by that is that, similar to what Marx argued about the ideological role of religion in the 19th century in terms of covering up, ignoring, marginalizing the deep class conflicts that were actually organizing society and deflecting the possibility of making a good world to some sort of world in the future, in the hereafter. Isn't it the case that much, not all, but much of the environmental ecological argument has exactly the same structure? Basically saying, yes, we do know that the world is an ecological pickle, but if we can handle the environmental question, and it's particularly acute in the climate debate, where many activists, well-meaning people from a variety of ideological positions seem to argue that if we bring climate change under control, if we can re-engineer it, re-engineering in different ways, then that will be ecologically more sensible and, more importantly, will be more socially inclusive. It will produce a more socially inclusive world, cohesive world. That's basically not true at all. That is precisely what Marx would call an ideological displacement that fundamentally ignores the deep violence that is being inflicted as a consequence of climate change, which is indeed the case, but we all know that climate change is the result of the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which we all know where that comes from and who is responsible for that. Yeah, I don't have to explain to you in great detail who the engineers, the architects, the designers, and the practitioners are of the continuous pumping up, metabolization of fossil fuels, and it's pumping in the atmosphere. 80% of the world's population has nothing to do with it. Nothing. Yeah, it's 20% of the world's population, and of that 20%, there's only a few that are the real drivers of that. And that's what we know that. It's the same ones that produce these kind of deep injustices and inequalities that at the same time you produce the infernal environmental and climatic conditions that we're under. And I don't think that is such a secret. We all know that, don't we? What is untruthful about that? Should that kind of truth not be said and said again in intellectual academic encounters that claim to seek the truth, and then try in a variety of ways to mobilize the seeking of the truth, not the truth in a kind of modernist totalizing sort of way, you know, but going towards the truth rather than ignoring it, rather than presuming it's not there, assuming that, oh, we can just continue our civilization, which is exactly precisely what we're trying to do. But literally.
But couldn't the fact that all this discussion, everything is held in an academic milieu. It's researcher, designer, engineers. It's
if you think it's only done in an intellectual academic milieu, start going out. There is plenty of mobilizations. You know, if you look at Santiago de Chile, the Occupy movement, the Hong Kong movement, endless socio-ecological movements for justice, etc., that are fighting often on their own, often in very marginalized their positions. Is it not the great contradiction that, in contrast to the 1930s and the ascent of a struggling social democracy, that today we have many more social activists in the streets, social experimenters, insurgent architects that are trying to do all sorts of interesting things in all places around the world. I've never seen, it would be an interesting study, I've never seen so many people in different places doing different things, experimenting with different ways, technologies, designs, etc., with so little universalizing effect, with so little effect with respect to what is being taught and practiced in universities, whether it's in geography or sociology or history or design. That is the drama today. When in the 1930s, a budding social democratic movement was experimenting with collective provisions, the Berlages of this world were jumping on it and tried in very adverse conditions, to produce a different world, and succeeded with a high cost. We know that fascism and all the rest was one of the consequences of the perceived success of that. Why can't we not produce similar sort of alliances between the life forces out there who are actively trying to produce a different world and those in academia? Hence my example of the refugees today. Where is their architecture? Where is their design that helps them to realize what they basically are asking? I'm here, therefore I am from here, which is a basic democratic demand. Why? Yeah.
Sorry, I would like to come back to greet some part of great presentation. I like this reactivation of the sublime category. Can you maybe expand a moment on that? Because I think I intuitively understand what you want to say, but I would like to be sure that I interpret it in a correct way.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe just to first a short reconnection with Erik's comments of before. There is this really cool book of Kiel Mo, which is called Empire State Building, in which he exactly does the different accounting. He looks at the Empire State Building and how empire runs through it, state runs through it, and building. So he does this really interesting exercise. It's different accounting. He's an architect as well. So he does this different accounting really well. So yeah, have a look at that.
Can you send me the reference?
Yes, I will. Yeah. So that I think, so there are lots of really cool things going on, but it's tapping into them and finding them, and indeed making sure that alliances are formed. And it sounds a bit revolutionary, but there has to be some kind of critical mass, I think. But yeah, the sublime. Yeah, so I'm doing that work with Vera Vincenzotti, and she's a philosopher, and she's in landscape studies. And we were actually inspired by Mustafa Dikesh, He's a political theorist, and he's doing a lot of different work. But he has this incredible book about the politics of the sublime, in which he theoretically explores how there is political potential in this moment of disruption that the sublime can cause. And he especially connects it to the event, to the event of price. But Vera and I hope that we can also kind of bring it into design in a way to bring in the political into design, because that's a hard part. You can bring politics into design, you can bring sociopolitical agendas into design, but how to bring disruption and a political act into design, that's an entirely different question. So so we were a bit alarmed by today's kind of focus on fluidity. This in design is also kind of in the forms that are made, very fluid, continuous forms, very beautiful, picturesque imagery, where typically picturesque imagery has this framing in which most diverse elements are wrapped into a kind of a continuous fluid picture, and which is basically it's enjoyable, it's beautiful, but it does not instigate any reflection, and certainly not contestation. So that's why when we looked at the sublime and at Kant, at disinterestedness, the notion of disinterestedness, which is basically trying to, it's predicated on this rupture between subject and object, where the subject has a chance or can bring in reason and look at the landscape, at the objects in a disinterested, and that's not negative, in a disinterested way. So it's so and how we are going. So we churn it out theoretically, but how we are going to then bring it to design, that we are still figuring that out. We're not there yet. We are now looking mostly at arts, at the usual suspects, at Robert Smithson and Gordon Matta Clark, but we are not. So we're still figuring it out.
Thank you very much. No other questions? Are you reflecting? Are you try to assume? Valentin?
No more questions here, I think. Yeah.
No questions from the also the online people. Tommaso, I was waiting from you as something.
And I knew it.
Equality and
I knew
design.
I was just a bit sort of struggling in organizing a question, let's say. I have to say, Paolo, especially after the 2 days we have been working on the hypothesis of introducing other actors in the equality-inequality debates as other living species. So that's why today, for me, it's really difficult to let's say, participate in the debate. That's why I was a bit retreating, and I said, maybe I need more time. But now that I'm here, there is a point that I found very interesting, because I'm not sure that the question you were raising, though, that I would synthesize in saying, should a compromising approach be possible? for the architects and for designers, let's say, compromising, I would say, in the sense that we realize that once we try to integrate, let's say, other forms of project into the real world, forces are sort of expulsing positions. And in that sense, also Grit said at a certain moment, so should we find a third way that is not the one or the other? I'm just afraid that this compromising position is not is not even working. I mean, in the context of such a complex crisis of design, if we start to take a compromising position, opening to, let's say, balancing the reasons, for instance, accepting that inequality is not an absolute concept, we need to tackle it from point to point. I'm not sure this will be a positive path. So that's why I don't know exactly how to contribute in this conversation, because I'm stuck in this ambiguity of the discipline.
Yeah, yes, but I don't think, I think that the message of coming out of Erik and Grit is not a message of giving up or of remaining stuck somewhere. No, I think that is exactly the opposite, is that let's take the courage. What I was saying before was simply that this courage, in my opinion, has to be on both sides, inside the academia and outside of the academia. Of course, the different situations can ask for different types of contributions and of design, but the question of being brave and courageous and critical, I think it's something that we have to learn. And this is not just a task or a possibility or a freedom you have when you are in the academia. No, that should really permeate all your work. I mean, the engagement is going through it, And then in the different contexts, you can let's say having kind of radicality that is coherent to a certain condition, in which you can really bring radical hypotheses. And I do not agree completely with the critic that we were only radical in the 70s. I do not agree that there is radicalism also today, and we should not be nostalgic of that period, because we have to say new things, because otherwise, and this is a little bit the risk we have in many schools of architecture, that you are so nostalgic of the 70s and the 60s that you forget that now things are really different and you have to reimagine. Of course, you can be fed, you can be inspired, you can follow the suggestions, but we have to remake things, you have to reformulate things. And this is really a different moment. So,
and it's maybe also it's not necessarily big or this kind of, it doesn't necessarily require this kind of big intervention or big radical acts. I was thinking now of this article that was published a couple of years ago about a project that was done. And it was an article by Henrik Ernston and Aalto, and it was about a project in South Africa, I think, if I remember correctly, in which they used storytelling, and storytelling was a very effective way, apparently, in that case, to incorporate social justice concerns and to convince. So it's not this if you think of Berlage and of this big welfare urbanisms, then it's often with and Archizoom, it's often with this incredible radical imaginaries, drawings, strong language, but it can be done in very different ways and with very different methods. So
yeah. And for sure that there is a lot of in this moment, I think there is also a lot of attention, and the people also participating in a way that is, I mean, there is really a lot of attention on what design can do in this moment. And I think that this is the reason why I think we should hope. We should hope because we see that there is an understanding that design is not just a marginal cream that you put at the end of the story when everything has been already decided, and then you arrive with the cherry and the cream. No, it's something that can really be used not to deconstruct certain problems, to bring different images. So I think that in this sense there is an opening to design that is important. You, Grete, you were underlining, this fact that maybe in certain contexts, not really everywhere, but in certain contexts, design is now considered as a very important way to construct or deconstruct a problem, for example.
Yeah, I think we're in many, not in all, and I agree, but in many contexts where the crisis is over, the disciplinary crisis, we're done. There is authority again. So I think that as designers, we should really shake that off. That idea of disciplinary crisis. We should again take position. Yeah.
But what we are trying with this cycle of sessions, but also with the work with the students, is really to reflect on this notion of ecological transition, no? Where all the contradictions that Erik and you were mentioning are becoming clear, and how you can, without losing the point, because the point is that there is a change in any case. But so without losing the point that there is a change, so in any case we have to prepare ourselves and to reconstruct certain categories and the way of doing. But at the same time, we have to be able to understand that what is now happening, and I agree with Erik, is quite catastrophic. I mean, all the arguments are brought together in order to make of this moment another catastrophe. I mean, all the decisions that have been taken also by the different governments in the last weeks after the Glasgow agreements, they seem to go in an opposite direction, and they are clearly not looking at the question of inequality, and they are not looking for sure at the question of the ecological aspects. In fact, they are denying it, and all the policies we are seeing now coming, they are with the pretext of the transition. So the transition becomes the pretext for a strong new rationalization with a strong and massive use of materials, of resources, to go in a direction that maybe is not the one we have discussed or the one we were discussing, but it's another direction. It's a kind of different one. So I think that is very important in this moment to understand what is inside this concept of transition, and to work, let's say, trying to not to lose what is important to understand, but at the same time being able to criticize this kind of deviations that we see becoming the major streamline, let's say.
But Paola, don't you think that there is sort of the design and the discipline could and maybe is already quite brave, considering the situation, no?
Not always.
Not always, but it could. But designers could be brave. I mean, they should be suicidal in some cases. As you were saying, it's a matter of survival. If you want to reach the level in which design can...
Okay, but
then you need to accept a sort of, to compromise.
No, but I think that, and here is where I think that the academy is important. You can dig things. And I think Grete in her presentation, she was even speaking of history, and also Erik were speaking of history, the importance of history. Take the time to dig a little bit. This idea of going deeper in things, in the concepts, in the ideas that are proposed to you, I think that that's fundamental in a moment like this one, in general, but especially in this moment. But I stop.
Yeah, and also, but maybe that's another, I don't know, it's kind of an empty signifier, but also question boundaries in a certain way, like kind of who sits at the table when you design, who do you consult with? And it's not in the participation sense, but it's Jonathan Metzger, he's an urban planner at KTH in Stockholm. He at a certain point said, should we invite a representative of the Maldives at the table when we are planning when we are devising a transport plan with carbon emissions, which will have carbon emissions anyway? Does the representative of the Maldives needs to be there at the table, because they are the canaries in the coal mine. They are the ones that get flooded. So it's also about that, who do you involve? Where do you draw the boundaries of your intervention?
I also think there's too much belief and not enough faith. There is too many people believe that the market works, believe that a technical design solution exists, believe that design can do something. Perhaps it can't do anything at all. I don't know. There's too much belief and not enough faith. Faith that design can do something. Faith that an other world is possible. Faith that a more socially egalitarian and ecologically sensible world is possible. And the difference between belief and faith is that belief is something that someone else tells you to believe. As Aragon, the surrealist, already put in 1930, if you kneel long enough in front of the altar, you end up believing. Belief is the faith of someone else. Faith, in contrast, is something you have yourself. And I don't think that there's enough faith in the real possibility of changing the socio-ecological configuration that we inhabit. So I'm a strong advocate of faith in deep contradistinction to believe. We've all become believers because we're told to believe in X, Y, and Z. I don't think we have enough faith in what we really want is possible.
Wow. That's, I think, a very good way to conclude. If you agree. Thank you very much, Erik and Greet. Of course, it could be very nice to continue, but I think that we should.
I'm hungry. I'm hungry and thirsty.
Exactly.
I'm going on holiday tomorrow.
I'm smelling there is someone cooking something, and I'm becoming a little bit hungry. Thank you very much. Really, thanks a lot. And I hope that we can continue also in the future to have some moments of discussion like this one. And Valentin, you want to close maybe also for the students?
Yeah, thank you very much to be there also physically. And we hope the last one should be in presence. Let's see how the situation will evolve. And thank you very much again to Erik and Greet. And I hope I will see you physically soon. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.